Why did the school system fail?
I'm going to start this video with two stories, both of which I think are indicative of an underlying point that's doing incredible damage to our society.
Okay.
The first story is that I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and I was driving a friend who was visiting my area to the Battle of Gettysburg,
Okay.
which was one of the biggest battles in the Civil War.
Yeah, that was like a 3-day battle, right? And then you had the Gettysburg Address after it. Yeah,
hours
pretty
from where
important.
I grew up. In the town of Gettysburg, we visited an antique toy store, and the obscurity of some of the toy soldier sets they sold absolutely shocked me. Something that just got stuck in my head was that they had a toy soldier set from the 1950s about the Barbary Wars. For those of you that don't know,
I don't know.
Those were a brief series of wars in the early 1800s in which the United States destroyed the Barbary Corsairs, or North African pirates, for hijacking American trade.
Okay.
It's one of the more obscure and kind of badass things.
Was that during the this was near 1812, so I'm going to assume this is also the era during British impressment, which was leading up to the Forgotten War of 1812, where basically France and Britain was fighting, and America wanted to trade with both of them. So I'm going to assume it's during that same time period.
America's done that almost no one's heard of. However, the thing that really shocked me here is that they were expecting 10-year-olds in the 50s to know about this war, and furthermore, to care enough about it to buy a toy soldier set on the topic. The thing is that I run a history YouTube channel with what I think is a very smart audience that watches it today, and I expected most of the people listening to this video to not have heard of that war. The free market was the same back in the 50s as today, where people would make...
I think there's something more to it, too, because I think as you move further along through history, the stuff that's seen as not as significant, like the war of fighting, like, African pirates, doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's interesting, sure. It doesn't really matter all that much. I think as we move further along in time, where you have less and less personal accounts of people who actually dealt with this, suddenly it becomes less significant. Because you were alive during the 1860s, you probably knew about this because you probably may have had a relative, or maybe there was someone in the newspaper that you read about that actually had an experience with this, or maybe fought in it. Where now, those people are dead. The people who knew those stories are now dead. So as time moves on, these aren't the stories that really are, that they don't really matter that much in history.
Products that other people would buy. And the fact that they made a toy soldier set on this war means that there was a market of 10-year-olds who had heard about the Barbary Wars. I love little snapshots like this from history, since by looking at tiny details from earlier eras, you can see how vastly different their lives were.
Yeah.
An example of this sort of principle is how Chinese women in the 19th century would beg to have their daughters' feet broken to make them more attractive. Seeing this toy soldier set nearly a year and a half ago set up a mental chain of logic that's been battling around my head ever since. How has our society gotten so culturally illiterate? Speaking of illiterate, to get to the second...
The other reason for this, off the top of my head, is that since more and more of news is coming through media, specifically television, and now social media, less of it is coming through the newspaper. And I think because you had so many Americans that would read the newspaper, companies could get away using a higher vocabulary, and it would allow people to have it would allow them to have a higher vocabulary because they're reading new words every day. Also, people had a motivation to read, where today there's really a reason to have a high level of reading, because everything you read today, if you can read at a 6th grade level, that's good enough for today's standards. You don't really need to go beyond that. Where if you wanted to read the paper, you would need to have a high school level knowledge of English in order to be able to read the paper. What's up, Colorado Bay?
Point. There was a study that came out about a year ago.
Actually, let me update the title so you know what I'm watching. This is going to be... I'm actually excited to watch this. Is this on the education system? It's a 50-minute video, so let's see what he's saying.
That 2/3 of 4th grade Americans, or for foreigners, people around age 10, are functionally illiterate. As a caveat, the definition of functionally illiterate matters a good amount here, where I don't think it's the same thing in America as the Congo, where these kids would probably be fine. And I also think a decent amount of this was COVID, which messed up education because it's difficult to motivate elementary school students to study hard when they're staring at a screen with all the distractions of home around them.
Well, I think it's more to that too. What's up, Nick News? It's more to that too, right? Because if you're growing up on an iPad, you don't need to read. Where if you're a kid, what's one of the things you would do, like if you're like 5, 6? Maybe you would have some sort of book or activity book or something. My point is you would have something that would involve words in some sense, where all you need to be able to do if you're a kid is be able to read a title. And even then, most YouTube videos have a thumbnail. You could get away with not really being able to read and be able to be just fine.
Furthermore, I've heard that this is true anecdotally. I've heard college professors say that the new batch of kids is just stupider than the previous ones.
I've heard about this.
I'll visit colleges and see the new classes are more anxious, less knowledgeable, less skilled, literate, and more than the generation before.
I think it's a reflection.
These changes are
on
happening
high school
so
education
fast
a
that it's
bit.
difficult to study them. And ironically, they probably won't be studied seriously ever, given the people who do study this sort of thing, namely universities, will look very bad for studying them. However, this appears to me
I think there's more to it too, right? Because first off, I think there's less of a focus on phonics and grammar, and especially because if you're using the internet and you type something, it'll just be corrected for you. So there's not really much of a focus on grammar. Like I was taught grammar and phonics at a young age, but I wasn't re-taught it. So I know it, but if you asked me to point it out to you, I couldn't because I wasn't really taught it again in high school. I think that's part of the issue, and I think the other part of the issue is that people are just reading less. And because people are reading less, I think it's causing the literacy rates to go down.
Be a really obvious issue that we need to tackle and think seriously about as a society. This is a video to try to figure out what's gone wrong with the American educational system. It's just going to focus here upon primary or grade schools, and I'm going to deal with colleges and universities in a future video.
I'm glad he's doing this because this is an important distinction simply because for a college, you have to pay to go there, where that grade level education generally is free. So
I was originally going to write about both, but this video's already too long.
Oh, then obviously college education isn't required. So pretty much everyone has a high school education. There are very few who don't.
The fundamental question of this video is why is the American educational system so expensive, biased, ineffective, and disliked by the population?
All right, I'm excited.
The answers cover a surprising range of history, anthropology, philosophy, game theory, and biology. Let's tackle a topic that I know we've all dealt with personally. People tend to have very defensive reactions.
But here's the thing, right? Is even though they have to teach, I think the real question is, why is it that people were, at least in America, right? Why were people more educated back then than they are now?
Actions when I say that we in the Western world are less educated and intelligent than our ancestors. Our current age of history has an enormous superiority complex where we imagine every other era of history to be idiots that we have nothing to learn from. You see this implicitly in how our society rejects history or tradition, since we are clearly so superior that none of the lessons of our ancestors could ever be useful. Thus, the idea that we have in fact become less educated or intelligent is a direct affront to our entire self-conception as a culture. My reply to this is one of my favorite questions ever, which is, what evidence would you need to see to change your mind that our time of history is less intelligent than the past? There are a bunch of pieces of evidence that
this proof that they knew stuff, I
fit
guess,
together,
right?
Which lead me to believe that the conclusion that we've dumbed down as a society is, in my opinion, irrefutable. Let me start on
I'm not surprised, right? Because, think about what most people do today and most of the jobs people have. Most of the jobs don't really have that much skill involved, where if you think to like ancient societies, what types of jobs people have, you would be a farmer, you would be making clay, and that's the thing too, so much stuff's mass-produced, so by doing that, by things being mass-produced, there's not as much technical skill involved. Obviously, it takes technical skill to create it, but most people working the job don't need technical skill. where people who actually made it by hand need to have high technical skill. So I think that is a fair point.
Intuitive basis. I read history books from
I mean,
different
you
eras
might be
of
the
history.
older generation. I think it's a balance, right? Because the older generation, yeah, it was simpler, but at the same time, now we have technology. It's kind of like a pros and cons situation where I don't think you could ever be in a perfect situation. So let's take advantage of what you have.
As part of my research. I think every era of history has certain biases, and it's important to be aware of our era's biases by reading older books. Through this, you can read different perspectives. On a purely intuitive basis, I would say that the best history writing was sometime around World War II. This was when a very disproportionate amount of the authors that I respect the most, whether Amaury de Raincourt, William McNeill, Carroll Quigley, J.F.C. Fuller, Ralph Linton, Will Durant.
Oh, look at this. I just noticed this. Do you guys, I don't know if you guys see it, Sex and the Power in History. Interesting title for a book, but I find this really interesting because there's actually a specific topic in history, which is just studying how perception in history has changed over time. That's actually a entire scope of history that you could study.
Or Winston Churchill were writing. That era is one where it can combine the sweeping generalizations of the Victorian period, where they do stuff like talk about Oriental despotism and degeneracy, or the Roman Empire rising and falling due to its collapse in manly vigor, combined with the autistic data focus and obsession with minutia that characterizes the post-World War II philosophy of history. For a single generation around World War II, you were able to combine both, and I think you got what could be the best history writing in the history of the world from it. However, there are a couple things that strike me about this.
Right?
The first is I don't think a lot of people will be physically capable of reading older history books. Take Will Durant.
I think that's
He's one of my
fair.
favorite authors, and he wrote an 11-volume history of human civilization, which I would highly recommend. I consider myself a decently smart guy, but I struggle to read Will Durant. My friends in high school had a game when I was reading Will Durant of find the end of the paragraph. He wrote these 1,000-page history books in incredibly complicated language about topics such as medieval philosophy, art, or lengthy sections on the art and character of the Age of Rousseau.
I think it's fair too because when you cover such a such a big topic, it makes sense to use a higher vocabulary to better explain what you want to say, because that's the value of having a higher vocabulary, is that the more words you have, the better you could express what you're trying to convey through words. What do I think the world will look like in 2080? Not much different from today.
The thing is that Will Durant's books were bestsellers. He was
it'll look different. It'll still be the same for the most part.
Famous in his time and lived quite well off purely his book sales. They were widely read and discussed, and an entire generation of American leadership grew up on Will Durant. I hang out with history people all the time, and I don't know any in my generation who tackle Will Durant, since he's so difficult to read. Will Durant would never get published today since he's too difficult. This doesn't even get to someone like Edward Gibbon, who wrote around the time of the American Revolution during the 18th century.
I could see that, right? Because if someone were to write something like that today, let's say they could write that well, because no one would understand it, no one would buy the books, people wouldn't recommend it. It'd probably get criticized for making it too complicated.
3,000-page The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is excruciating to read. It's a very well-written book, and my job is to read stuff like this, and I was only able to get 500 pages in.
I think the good thing about this, though, is that I think knowing that this is how people used to write, I hopefully, it does inspire me to be able to be better at reading more difficult stuff, because it's still English. I want to be able to understand it, because, this is the language I speak. I want to be able to understand what he's trying to say.
Those books were bestsellers, and if you read old biographies and novels from previous eras, lots of people read Gibbon. I have a book named Bullfinch's...
Well, I think it's worth pointing out, too, that why is this so complicated, right? I think a big reason for this is because what else is there to do with your time, right? If you have, especially if you're, I don't know, a young adult and you're not, well, maybe you are married, right? But let's say, I don't know, whatever. Let's say your kids are all grown up, whatever, right? What else is there to really do with your time? You know, when you come home from work, especially now, this is a time too where people are starting to get more rights for working, so they have 8-hour work days. You have a lot of time to be able to read these books. I think it's also important too, in the same vein, that even though they're bestsellers, not everyone's reading these types of books. So I think that's worth pointing out too. And I think we can have a bit of a bias because do you think the person that's working in the coal mines is reading these types of books? I don't really think so. I mean, it's possible, sure. But I think it's more likely that people who are college educated would be more likely to read these types of books.
Mythology,
I don't really know,
which was a 19th century anthology of
I'm just throwing the
mythology,
question
which
out
was
there.
written so that nouveau riche Americans would know the references to classical mythology that they would commonly see in art, plays, or casual conversation. There are loads of asides in the book where he says, I'm sure we've all heard the story of Cadmus or Narcissus in casual conversation.
I'm gonna be honest, I wish we did, because I think there is a lot of value in ancient stories, because the way I see it too, they're teaching truths, and I think the stories are good. And it's one of the things that bothers me, right? Because 8th grade was the only grade I was really taught, like, Greek stories, and now I'm just not taught them anymore. I'm like, because that was the only year I was taught the stories, and then never again. And it's kind of a thing, obviously, that's what's great about the internet, is I could go out my way to learn them. But in the same vein, I kind of wish I was taught them in school. I think that's another thing too, because since we talk about the education system, you have to wonder why is it I have to go out on my own to learn this? I again, it's good for self-discipline, but to an extent, I still have to wonder why is this not taught, you know?
It's so apparent in the book that these sorts of classical references were things people talked about on a daily basis. Reading Elizabeth Gaskell's book, North and South, which was written during the time of the American Civil War, but set in Britain, they talk about how a nouveau riche person had to cram knowledge of the classics and history to be seen as socially acceptable. Comedies
Really?
from the pre-1960s era casually make references to Edward the Confessor or obscure figures from history, and especially the Old West. The fact that that kind of social standard existed at all demonstrates a very, very different society from today. Outside of
I think it's worth questioning too, is that a good thing that you need to know so much? I don't actually know. I actually don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
the show, when I'm just in normal life, I try to not talk about history in casual.
I find American history very interesting, so I tend to not because I forget a lot of what I learned in 8th grade too. The only history I really remember that much of is American history, and also it's kind of because too the American history teacher I really liked his class, and I find American history very interesting. But a lot of stuff I learned in school, I don't really remember.
Conversation because I know people either don't know it and I don't want them to feel bad for not knowing it, or I know they don't care. And our society also judges people who like things like history, and especially so classical literature or mythology. You're called a nerd or pretentious.
I forgot about this. Is the other aspect too, right? It's actually interesting he points this out, because what he's showing is that there was a shift in society where we went from you have to know all this stuff to if you know all this stuff, you're a nerd or you're a loser, right? A very interesting shift.
That stuff.
Did sports play a role in this?
I think the fact that our society does this signifies that it has a lower intellectual level than previous societies, because
I think sports may play a role into this, because all of a sudden now, instead of spending time learning about these things, you're spending time playing a sport, so you don't have the time to learn these things. So it kind of makes sense that you wouldn't really know as much. I think sports might play a role into this.
A society of idiots would judge those who are not idiots. And it's pretty clear from all this evidence I'm showing you guys that these sort of topics like history or classical culture...
So you notice what you said, right? Idiots are judging non-idiots, right? I think what it shows is that their opinion would only really matter if they're majority. If a minority is making fun of a majority, it doesn't really work. Especially if you see it play out, there's strength in numbers. But if majority of people are not as smart, they don't know as much, and they're making fun of and now the minority is knowing a lot, I think that's what it really shows, is that suddenly it's becoming to not know that as much, it's suddenly becoming you're part of my majority if you don't know as much.
Culture were things that were normal in previous eras. I remember my grandpa grew up in the Irish ghetto, and he made a very strong effort to study culture and history so that he could fit in with the broader society more. As I've said before, anything you would choose to look at reflects this decline. The language in presidential speeches at the time of World War I was at a college-level reading level. Now it's at an elementary school level, a jump in nearly a decade of intellectual development. Again, these were people who were doing what they could to get elected. If their language is too fancy and it annoyed the general public and they didn't get voted into power, they would have changed it.
Actually, I think there's multiple layers to this, right? And the first layer, I think the part of the reason why it's a college level, his speech is at a college level of English, is because it was socially you had to be intelligent enough to understand it. So it shows that the president is intelligent enough. Because if he didn't give a speech at a college level, then he would be seen as an idiot. So why would you want to vote for an idiot? Where now all of a sudden it's being able to speak well is no longer valued highly. So I think that's the first layer to this. And then I think furthermore, the other layers, even if you had a president that were to speak at a college level, I don't know if many voters would be able to understand it, especially as more voters throughout American history, more and more groups of people have been allowed to vote, and I think majority of people wouldn't be able to understand a college level speech.
And because of that, it means the general person had to be at least capable of understanding what was being said. You can say only the elites read these books, but you can also look at other, more casual forms of communication. The letters soldiers in the Civil War or American Revolution sent use far more complex language than we do today. My grandmother...
This is what makes America so interesting, right? Especially their history, is because if you look at the history of most of the world, literacy was a very special thing that not many people had, where in America, for most of its history, literacy was something almost everybody had. And that's really impressive that most people are very literate. And I think that's the reason why the newspaper was able to exist in the first place. Because if not that many people were literate, you can't really sell them a newspaper if they can't read it.
There's really into genealogy, and she's collected hundreds of letters from my ancestors. My ancestors on my mom's side of the family tended to be business owners in the frontier, and they were people who were clearing the forest and actively fighting against nature, so not hyper-educated elites. And again, their language use is much more complicated than what we do today. We've also seen a bunch of other factors that act as proxy.
Let me see what this graph is. Performance declines with increasing age of speed of processing. Okay. Performance is preserved over age of world. Okay.
Albeit imperfect ones, for rapidly declining intelligence across the West over the last century. In high school, I was able to figure out that the speed someone twitches...
So it's basically saying, right, as people get older, they're generally having a better vocabulary, I believe it's what it's saying. Or am I reading this wrong?
Their eyes as a proxy for intelligence. And I was surprised to see later on the scientific consensus backed this up. The speed with which people move their eyes and reaction times, another proxy for intelligence, have collapsed very rapidly over the last century.
Hold up. Wait, no, is that actually true? Because I would assume that just because people are playing video games all the time, and like some of those games have insane reaction times, I would think that's true. Then again, maybe it's because you're reacting to certain things on the screen, you don't have as high of a reaction time to things that are not on the screen.
The factors we use to figure out IQ, which are the best predictors for IQ, have also declined incredibly rapidly. I will be clear that these educational standards were not uniform across the entire Western world. There were large areas of staggeringly poor education, such as the American South, Ireland, large parts of Eastern Europe, or even most people in France were illiterate into the late 19th century. In a lot of societies, such as England, the differences in education between social classes were staggering. While in the
North, you actually see the separation of the North and the South too, just from travel routes of like paths people would travel. If you were to look at a map, most of the routes is in the north, and then the West, and there's very few in the South. and I don't. It would take too long to explain why that is. But basically, the reason why is because slavery was so detrimental to the Southern economy that basically no one wanted to be around it.
Northern US, almost everyone of any social class was educated. However, the highs of Western civilization are much lower today than they were 100, 200, or 300 years ago. When I bring this kind of evidence up, I get a couple different reactions.
Okay,
The
what are
first
they?
is that you can't classify people by intelligence. This is
I
patently
think it's
false.
a reasonable metric. I think also what this shows that this is being said is that it also shows again that there's been a rise of individualism, and I think this is where this stems from. Is that I do agree, right? I am all for not using labels, but I think when you want to get an average intelligence, I think using a label is reasonable.
For one, are we really going to say Lil Pump and Einstein have the same amount of horsepower firing in their brains? Or that Newton's law of motion is of equal brilliance to some random college paper?
I mean, to be fair though, right? Let's be fair. If we're gonna make that kind of comparison, what do we compare? Obviously, he's a scientist, right? So that's what he knew. Well, what about someone like Steve Jobs, the guy who invented the iPhone? He had to be pretty smart to be able to develop that. What about Bill Gates? He created Windows and made all these programs. I mean, I would say he's pretty intelligent too, right? Now it's a bit different because programming is a newer thing. I think to be able to create that product and have that idea means they're pretty smart. So I think this is not a fair comparison.
I do stand by intelligence being impossible to measure objectively, though. I think IQ is a real thing and very important, however.
I've seen the whole point. The whole point is that everyone has some sort of intelligence metric, and the point of IQ is to create some way of measuring it through speech and math. But obviously there are issues that, for example, what if you don't really speak English? It's kind of difficult to tell. But I think IQ is a reasonable metric for averages. For an individual, if you want to say, is person A or B smarter, I don't think that's a fair comparison. But if you want to compare the average population of past America to present America, I think that'd be reasonable to use.
I don't think it measures the totality of intelligence. Partly as an example why, my father's side of the family were all illiterate Irish peasants. They would have scored very low in IQ since they grew up in a society without clocks or they knew anyone who could write. But them and I are genetically identical. Genghis Khan or Muhammad would have had the same issues, where they were both illiterate but objectively geniuses. The cultures that do best on IQ tests are those that train people.
That's the bias of IQ tests, is that even though trying to measure general intelligence, it relies on skills that have to be learned that can show the intelligence.
Be the best at taking tests. I took an IQ test as a kid and I scored 110, and I barely passed high school STEM. And I think that's partly since I had a pretty nasty childhood, which might have messed up the test results when I took them as a kid. However, I'm also just bad at math, spatial skills, or moving shapes, which is what IQ measures disproportionately. I'm much better at constructing
too, for IQ, I think math, especially because it's not really as useful. I mean, I don't know if it's exactly a fair metric to use by today's standards.
Use mentalizing, empathy, pattern recognition, while I have photographic memory for sound and maps, and I can understand and figure out how systems work easily. With apologies for the bragging, IQ measures none of that stuff, but it's still some form of intelligence that we know is real. All of this is meant to show that intelligence does exist, but it can't be measured. It's in the same manner that there is very clearly good or bad art, people, or food, but it's impossible to measure if, say, Michelangelo's David is better than the Mona Lisa, or if Gandhi was a better person than St. Francis of Assisi. Another response I often get is that we've simply moved what kind of intelligence we care about.
It's still art, right? But what I mean is, it's still different because it's subjective. I don't think that was fair to say. Absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is, it's subjective, and you can't really measure something that's subjective.
In society. I often hear that since my speciality is in the humanities, that I am biased towards that topic, while we ignore how knowledge in the sciences has grown precipitously. Biased. There is an element of truth to this, that over the last 70 or so years, our education system has massively downplayed the humanities, which used to be completely synonymous with education itself, to put more effort into STEM. In other words, if you're on the smart track, you'll be taking classes in calculus or computer science, not classics, military history, or Hermeticism.
Well, I think there's reasons to this too, right? Because even though we see a focus on individualism, kind of counterintuitively, we're seeing less of a focus on being treated as a human being. What do I mean by that? A lot of the jobs today, we have office jobs. A lot of the jobs where you work at fast food restaurants. What are a level? I mean, in New Jersey, right? That's just not a fair comparison, right? But in New Jersey, people fill your gas. What are jobs like retail? Retail's another one, right? These are jobs where you're not really treated as a human. You're treated as a machine doing a task. And I think because of that, I think that kind of plays an effect into why this is.
However, the general public literally knows nothing about science. Even among educated people, there are serious political ramifications to this across our society, in that, with scientific illiteracy, such as the left pushing for complete racial or sexual equality in society, with using the blank slate, or that all people can be programmed from childhood and are functionally...
Because again, we're seeing it same with jobs, where people are being treated as a machine and a program that just do a task. They're not being treated as a human being that has needs, they actually, they have motivation, stuff like that. I think this is really just a big problem with society as a whole right now.
Mentally the same. No one serious in the sciences believes that today across the political spectrum. The idea that men and women are the same or biological race doesn't exist has been completely disproven for about a decade, but our society continues to run by it and push agendas that are dependent upon it because the population is so
people have theory. I don't know why this is, to be honest. I'm going to just assume it's ignorance.
Scientifically illiterate.
Or maybe it's people believing something that they want to be true. I think that's more so the case. I think that's the only reason why we'd be in such a
The average person has no concept of how insane modern physics is, how space and time are the same, how they can rip apart with enough pressure which causes black holes, that gravity can...
But did people back then, like 100, 200 years ago, were there a lot of people back then that knew about this compared to today?
Controls the speed of time, or other stuff that Einstein discovered a century ago. In fact, I think of Carl Sagan's description of what a scientifically illiterate society would look like, which I've put on the screen here, and it almost exactly fits what our culture looks like. People also like to say...
let me read this. The consequence of scientifically illiteracy are far more dangerous in our time than in any that has come before. It's perilous and foolhardy for the average citizen to remain ignorant about global warming, say, or oxygen depletion, air pollution, toxic radio waves, appearing. Alright, I see his point, right? Because here's why it's bad, is because if people don't know about this, they are not going to push for this. Won't push for change, is the point, right? So if you don't know about what's actually going on, you won't push for change, and it's going to make problems worse. And this is just one example you gave. Jobs and wages depend on science and technology. Yep. If our nation can't manufacture at high quality and low prices products people want to buy, then industries will continue to drift away, transfer a little more prosperity. We are seeing this to other parts of the world. We already are seeing this. Consider the social ramifications of fission and fusion power, supercomputers, data, highways, abortion, radon, massive reductions, strategic weapons, addiction, government, eavesdropping, the lives of citizens. Yeah, we are seeing... I'm surprised how accurate this is. High resolution TV, airline and abortion safety, airport safety, federal tissue plans. I want to get to the point. Finding cures for AIDS and cancer. How can we affect national policy or even make intelligent decisions in our own lives if you don't grasp the underlying issue? Yeah, exactly. What do you guys think of this? I thought that was very... I think he actually does get to the point, right? Is because if people understand what's to be solved, especially because it's America's democracy, if no one's pushing for a change or they understand why it's important, then no one will fight for it.
That our loss of knowledge in the humanities has been offset by greater technological progress, but that's not true. People like to say that technological progress has been occurring exponentially faster, but the reality is that
the reason people say that is because you're seeing it a lot with technology. I mean, that's very vague. I realized how dumb that was. You're seeing it a lot with electronics. That's what I meant to say. You're seeing a lot of developments in programming, not so much other aspects.
Technological innovation, by any objective measurement you'd pick, whether amount of breakthroughs, patents per capita, technological change per capita, has
Yeah, I think the reason people say this, again, has to be with programs created and stuff that's I think people view as more important than it may actually be.
Around 1870 has been in decline for 150 years since. We're now at the rate of technological growth of the 1600s today. We've reached the point where I hope the decline in educational standards is evident to the audience. The question to ask at this point is why, especially given the amount of education an average person receives has gone up vastly in the last century. At the time of the American Civil War, 0.5% of the population went to college. The purpose of college in that era anyway was mostly drinking and partying for elite networking. Now about 1/3 of the population goes to some form of college, whether 4-year or community college. It was normal for people in the very educated northern states to stop what we would consider to be schooling at middle school, and for their schooling to be in one-room schoolhouses with a single teacher. However, this society very clearly outcompeted us on educational output and educational level for the entire society.
Maybe, let me try and think about this, right? So, two things. Kids are dropping out in middle school, and you have, like, one teacher. So what can we draw from this? I think the first thing is that we actually are seeing a lot of kids who are learning stuff either through their parents or on their own. I think the second thing we see from this is that maybe having teachers specialize in certain fields may not actually be that beneficial. I don't actually know, though.
I believe this is due to a handful of factors, which largely coalesce around the self-interests of different social sets in our society. No one involved planned or wanted this. However, it happened since it was easier for these groups' incentive structures, and it occurred over the process of centuries without us knowing. Why is equality good? I want you to spend a second thinking about that. Most of us have been told ever since the cradle that equality is naturally one of the highest virtues. However, we all know that people really aren't equal. Napoleon is better than Honey Boo Boo by any conceivable metric. If they aren't equal, why do they deserve the same things? Our society treats equality as a natural good, driven fundamentally off faith.
Let me actually look at the picture, because I think this explains it, right? What he was trying to show. Equality gives everyone the box, where equity gives people what they need. I think that's the difference, right? Because it's a big misconception people have where giving everybody the same is fair. But that's not actually the case. And obviously you have this image depicting, oh, right, this kid has what he doesn't need. So, let me see what he... And again, right, obviously, famous figures, another example, right? Someone like George Washington will accomplish more than pretty much everyone, most people watching this ever will. Not to knock on you, but I'm just saying the fact that George Washington accomplished a lot.
To be fair, I think equality is good if it can be paired with greatness. A society without any sense of equality will devolve into horrifying oppression and tyranny, while one with no sense of superiority and greatness will consume itself through monotony, envy, and resentment. Or exactly what's happening to our society. People believe things for reasons, and they believe things that help them. The reason equality is important to our society is firstly since the invention of the firearm democratized the battlefield, where aristocracy made sense in a society in which you had to spend 10 years studying the blade in order to fight well as a knight. Secondly, industrial civilization prizes uniformity. This is since in a factory, the more uniform you make things, the more interchangeable, and thus the process is cheaper.
But know what, though, is that even though that's the case, this existed hundreds of years ago, yet these people were better educated.
Industrial civilization's natural incentive is thus to push for uniformity at all costs. This also explains our society's obsession with multiculturalism. In a society in which it's cheaper to coordinate manufacturing over many countries, where a t-shirt is often produced in over a dozen different nations before ending up on your shelf, multiculturalism benefits the elite since it makes this cooperation across many different cultures easier and thus cheaper. The thing here is that this process will try to turn things into interchangeable cogs, including the people in the process itself. You need to be able to get people to show up for their shifts at the factory where they do their
This goes into what I was saying earlier, which is that a lot of the jobs we have today, people aren't treated as people, they're just treated as a cog that's helping the machine going. And by doing so, especially, that's not good for society as a whole.
One task on repeat, have them show up at the exact same time when the machine has to run, and then send them home at the exact same time while they do their appointed thing. The problem here is that humans didn't evolve for this. We evolved to hunt and forage. After that, we adapted over thousands of years to farming, which was
I think the point is people evolved to develop skills. That's what people evolved to do. If you have someone doing the same task for over 20 years, it gets to a point where you can only be so good at pressing a button before there's nothing really to learn anymore.
Done in seasonal turns inside villages with people we knew. Humans evolved for changing and variable work with people they knew. We really don't like the monotony that industrial civilization entails. The entire genius artistic output of the last 150 years has been a rebellion against industrial civilization for a reason. The modern education system was founded in the early 19th century in Prussia and then secondarily Scotland. Prussia was a country in Central Europe stuck on a flat plain, surrounded on all sides by brutal invaders. The warfare of that time involved tremendous discipline, in which armies would stand in straight lines and fire against each other. Their school system was explicitly designed to churn out men who would happily do what, from the perspective of human nature, was a bizarre thing. Scotland was one of the first places where the Industrial Revolution took place, and in the same manner that the educational system was designed in Prussia to produce docile soldiers,
it didn't really work out for them, though, right? Because Scotland
was
lost.
Redesigned to make good factory workers. The modern educational system was very explicitly designed to turn people into good factory workers. In fact, it spread in exactly the same time, in the same places as the Industrial Revolution. This is something the founders of the American public school system were very clear about. The people who founded the American public school system and those who updated in the early 20th century openly said they were doing this to make more efficient workers. The thing is that for public schools, the expectation was that the kids leaving this would be working in factories.
So I think the point he's trying to make here is that what people are doing for jobs has shifted, but school hasn't. I think that's what he's trying to say.
The elite who manage the factories would go to private schools and attend colleges, which, before World War II, were basically elite networking institutions. The modern public school system was changed around World War I in America in a very profound way, as part of a series of profound cultural changes called the Managerial Revolution. This is the process that created our modern ruling class, in which the West went from a society run by hereditary nobility or business moguls to one run by college-educated managers or bureaucrats. There were a series of concerns at the time which crystallized into creating the scheme of what modern education is today. In America, this period was a reaction to, first of all, mass immigration, to which nativism became a powerful sentiment to assimilate the immigrants, and also the integration of the vastly different regional cultures inside America. There was, of course, the Industrial Revolution and World Wars, both of which created incentives to make people docile. There was the Managerial Revolution, in which you had to train a bureaucratic ruling class, as well as the massive increases in quality of life due to science. All of these factors added together to create an incentive towards an educational system that prized conformity, docility, systematizing, measuring, and math, or science, against the humanities. In America, this was largely done by New England Yankees, who imprinted their values upon the public school system. This is why stuff like sports, waking up early, lots of homework, and more ended up in the public school system, since those were things that the Yankees viewed as positives in of themselves, while the rest of the country frowned upon them. You can blame the people at the
Okay.
time, but they were doing what made sense given the incentives that their circumstances gave them.
Okay,
If you
that
know
makes
your
sense.
students will spend their whole lives doing boring factory jobs, the best thing you can do is prepare them for that life. If your country doesn't do that, it's doomed against a country which does industrialize. If you know that the way war is fought is
Well,
by
also you have people. You also that leads to unemployment. So you have people that if they can't really get their job, not only will be inefficient, but it creates a situation where just people have less jobs.
standardizing large amounts of men to charge machine guns, you need to train them to do that in school so the Nazis don't win. Since the endpoint of industrialization is standardization, what occurred here is that everyone was trained to this new baseline of factory workers, including the elite. Something that's pretty shocking about modern America is no one claims to be the ruling class. This isn't something I see in any other era of history. In
That is
all other
interesting, actually,
times,
now that I
those
think
in
about it.
charge take pride in it. However, in modern America, everyone wants to be an everyman working
Mm-hmm.
Joe or the counterculture. Even the elite today
Yeah,
pretends
you're right.
to be
We
the
do
rebel.
see this. I think counterculture is very interesting because we see it all the time on the internet, where it's cool to do what's against culture, and what we see a lot is if you do something enough that's counterculture, eventually it becomes culture, and then it's no longer cool anymore, and then it becomes cringe, right?
And that the leftist elite LARPs that they are fighting the establishment while they are the establishment. An example of this is that if you're in a position of leadership, the wise thing to do is not work that much, and instead train your mind through various exercises to be tough, wise, and intelligent. The thing with leadership
sure.
is they don't have to work because they have people beneath them who can do that. Their place is to make correct decisions and provide leadership, which is what their role in the organization is. One of my friends said that as a CEO, your job is to make the 5 important decisions a year that determine the survival of your company.
Okay.
You need to have a clear head to be able to make those decisions correctly, so an overworked leadership class is dangerous. This was the consensus across every society in history,
Okay, that
and
makes
it's why
sense.
the aristocracy in every society doesn't work. They need to be ready in positions of great stress like leading armies, making intellectual breakthroughs, or important decisions. These things are
It does create a situation though where it's high stress, it matters a lot, but because it's very sporadic and you don't do it as much, it comes across as being easy, which maybe it is, but because of that, it creates a situation of jealousy. And I don't really know if there's a way to solve that. It's just the way it is.
incredibly nerve-wracking, so you need to mentally recharge and also train your brain with wisdom and courage in advance. This is why in every major society, the education of the aristocracy entails studying the classics and things like horseback riding, managing their estates, or fighting. Studying the classics increases wisdom, or the ability to judge information correctly, by reading lessons from the wisest people of the past. You can't know what struggles the next generation will face, and the information that will be pertinent to them will change. However, you can train them to be able to understand, through timeless truths, how to deal with the new problems that they will face in their lives.
I guess that
Meanwhile,
makes sense, right? Because it makes sense why you have those Greek stories that exist in the first place. And then also, what comes to mind too is what is it? The Prince, where the book that asks questions, it's better to be feared or to be loved.
stuff like horseback riding, jousting, or managing the family estate teaches real-life skills. Riding a horse trains someone in leadership because an emotional animal like a horse is a lot like a crowd. The pain of dueling or jousting teaches how life is difficult and that pain is real. Managing a family business teaches real-life skills.
Yeah.
Experience and practicality is the most important thing. Someone can theoretically know how to solve a problem, but that's nothing compared to actual experience. The reason I went on this tangent is to explain a completely different educational model, that which the
Like the point
aristocracies
is that the educational model was relevant for the needs of society.
use in every other historical society. We may look askance at it, but it provides much better results than what we have today. The British Empire was built off following this system, as were the Romans and even the American Empire. This is how the Founding Fathers, or FDR, were educated. In our society, we train the elite to act like workers. Something I see that's very common with CEOs or other leaders is that they will work all the time, filling their life with busy work since they don't know how to do anything else. However, they can delegate that work. What their company really needs them to do is big
Make the
picture
big
thinking,
decisions,
charisma,
right.
and innovative solutions, and that's why they're the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
However, the school and social system has trained them to work like factory workers.
But
And
know what though is that here's the thing though, right? Is that not everyone's gonna be a CEO. So I don't know how strong a point this is because yeah, that's for the leaders, but all that really shows is that if you're gonna be in a position where you're a CEO, that you should receive a higher level education. Because if you notice, all those like higher up people were people that had the position pretty much promised to them in the first place. So they had a reason to learn this stuff. Where, you know, if you don't know you're going to be a CEO and then you become a CEO, it would make sense. You'd have to go out of your way to learn this.
so they do it because it's what they know. Our system means that no one will take responsibility for the management of society, which has meant that our society is very poorly governed and is collapsing now. Our elite doesn't know any history, wisdom, has any sense of toughness or realness. Thus, they make spectacularly stupid decisions, which we see all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Something to consider is that we are the only era in history which structures education uniformly across the population. What this means is that children
That's not exactly true though, right? Because even though public education is available to everybody, it ignores that there's private education and then you could pay for tutors. I think what is this point though is that there's a I think what he's saying is that there's a standard education that everyone needs to learn. So there are certain requirements that you need to know. I think that's what he's trying to say.
The most expensive private prep schools are taught the same subjects in roughly similar format to people attending low-level public schools. They have classes with standardized times where they take tests on subjects like math, English, or chemistry. This is something that we take for granted as being obvious, but it's not historically normal. We do this in our society since our self-interest is to turn people into being as much of interchangeable cogs as possible.
Mm-hmm.
However, in every other culture, your education was dependent upon your geographic region, your social class, and what occupation you'd have, as well as your sex. I explained how the aristocrats were educated, but if you were a fisherman, you were taught to do that.
Yeah.
If you were a craftsman, to do that and more. Our system
Well, I think
works...
what makes it kind of different though too is that in America you have the ability, you have more flexibility to choose the type of job you want. So I think it's ignoring that. I think that's part of just America's whole set. You're not stuck into one job position. You have flexibility to move. Now it can be difficult, sure, but you could still do it. Where if you're a fisherman back then, if you wanted to eventually not be a fisherman and be something else, I don't know if you'd be able to do that easily.
Better for our current society, but I'm not certain if it is a self-evidently better system. You might say our model has higher social mobility, but that's statistically not true. There were many periods of the pre-industrial world that had higher social mobility than today. We actually have pretty low social mobility, the lowest so of any era in American history now.
Is that actually true?
Also, this solves the problem of how schools today don't teach any skills that are actually useful for the workplace today.
Mm-hmm.
A short answer is that a system based on standardization will push down the high achievers in order to raise the average. In the pre-public...
I see. Yeah, this is a big problem, right? Because the point he's saying is that because people aren't learning as people who can have the capacity to learn more aren't really learning much more, or they aren't really taught stuff that's relevant. No one's being taught anything that's relevant, and when it's time to actually get your foot on the ground, you're already at a disadvantage because you're much older, where generations before you would be a much younger age where you would be put in that
school
position.
System, certain areas had much higher educational attainment than today, such as Scotland or the American North, and others had much lower, such as the American South or Ireland. However, what has happened is that we've pulled down the top level to pull up the bottom level, although often not by much, with the example of the Black American...
Right, because although it sounds kind of harsh to say, the people at the bottom level, let them be at the bottom level, I think. Right? Because if they don't, I don't see you. Why are we trying to force somebody to do something that they don't really want to do.
Community. Something that I honestly feel resentful about is that I've become a success.
I didn't even realize the point of the graph is that this is based off of race. So it's a big problem too, is that instead of actually treating people as an individual and based on what they actually know, you want to make everything equal by race. Whereas obviously stupid to do that, because that's not actually fixing the reason why we're at the position we are today.
Black American community. And I get a lot of praise now for what I do. However, no one ever told me I was smart, had any promise for the future, or encouragement in school before I turned, say, age 18 or 17. When this YouTube channel took off, I couldn't believe all the praise I was getting, since I just assumed I was a normal person with no potential, since that's what everyone around me told me. I was reading 75 books a year by the end of middle school, and I could draw any country in any year of history.
I'm actually jealous.
At the same time, but until the end of high school, none of the educational system reflected any of my possible strengths. I did poorly at math and science, and I was bad with precise stuff like punctuation. I hated school since my only feedback was teachers telling me to improve my punctuation, while not thinking at all about the ideas that I was writing about. If this YouTube channel hadn't taken off, I would have probably slid between the cracks and be working a minimum wage job now. The school system doesn't offer any individuality and punishes people who deviate.
Because the point is that it's better, I think it's what he's trying to say is, for people with the capacity to succeed, the mobility is there, but it's not really being pushed as much. I think part of that's kind of reflected, though, from jobs as a whole, because we're seeing a lot of jobs where you can't really climb the ladder in a sense by staying in one job. You have to move to different jobs to be able to get higher positions. And that's a whole problem too of the people who get put in those positions eventually end up in a position where they're mediocre.
From the factory norm. The goal is to get people into college, and anything that deviates from that is bad. Even if it's positive things like creativity, interest in other subjects, or having a lot of energy. Carroll Quigley, one of the greatest historians in history, wrote in the 50s that the end growth of the bureaucratization of education would be that the brilliant would be viewed by the managerial education system as annoying problems to be pushed downwards rather than flowers to cultivate. The system of test-taking would benefit those with more rigid minds and who had chips on their shoulders. It would actively push against rewarding creativity. He said that this will actively decline the choice-making and ability of the ruling class. An example of this sort of thing is that when I went to public school, the Bush administration's No Child Left Behind test-taking policy was kicking in, where, according to how well schools took a test, that determined their funding. And what happened was that...
And it's such an obviously stupid decision, because he already discussed in the beginning of the video, that you can't really have an objective measurement of intelligence. Whenever we're treating a test as it's an objective measurement of intelligence in the first place. And why does it need to be, you don't get your funding if the kids do well? Shouldn't we be giving the schools funding anyway? If it's not being spent properly, do you really think that if the kids do well, it's actually going to get spent properly? Because you're motivating teachers to teach more to a test and less to actual teach things that matter, like ideas.
We would spend 4 months a year studying on how to take the test. Not even knowledge on the test, just various hacks and systems tricks to increase our score on the test rather than actually learning anything.
And how does that benefit you in real life? Not at all. This does not benefit you whatsoever. You could say, it helps you limit options. You should, instead of trying to focus on limiting options, should be trying to figure out what option is best for me. This has no point is this clearly has no benefit to your life whatsoever.
So it actively hurt our education to increase our school's funding. Something I see to a greater and greater degree every year is people just acting like zombie-like NPCs. I made a full video at NPCism, and I talk about how it is the end growth of the standardization coming from the Industrial Revolution. I see each generation today becoming more and more like zombies.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair criticism by older generations that a lot of...
Why are we surprised though, right? All the jobs are monotonous. There's no need to be able to do anything other than what you're told. With social media, you don't really interact that much. Most students like take the fastest. Yeah, because like the thing is too is by taking they're taking the fast path, lowest distance. The issue is that they're no learning's actually happening. I think this reflects best in the amount of how only a small amount of people actually learn different language for school. Now the main language that's secondary language that's taught in schools is Spanish, but there are a lot of kids, many kids that do not learn Spanish. Like, and the thing is that there are a lot of kids I know, this is anecdotal, but I think it still is relevant. Is there a lot of kids I know that have great grades in Spanish, and I'll ask them, so what do you know in Spanish? They know nothing. But they're in AP Spanish, or they're in honors Spanish, but they can't speak Spanish. And I think with a language like Spanish, you can't just make someone memorize stuff, because that's not how a language works. Language is dynamic, and language is much more based on ideas. So you can't just make someone learn a language by testing how well they can, write stuff. Not even like writing's part of it. Sure, you can't really test it just on taking a standardized test. This doesn't work.
Gen Z has no personal opinions, hobbies, drive, direction, personality,
Chosen,
and anything like that. It breaks my heart to see Gen Z kids like this. In fact, it's worse the higher someone's social class is and the better school they go to. I often feel like these kids have never had someone treat them like a real person, talk to them honestly about their future,
I'm very fortunate. That's the thing too is, there are very few teachers. Like, you do have teachers that treat kids like real people, but I think that's very valid, right? Is that people say all the time, kids aren't smart. That's true. Just because kids aren't smart doesn't mean that they're not a good that they're not people. They're still human beings. It's just that they don't know that much. They don't have that much experience. But I hate how socially how it's just okay to treat kids as they're not human beings when they are. I mean, I think it's not only extends to human beings, it's how we treat people as a whole.
Attention to their strengths or weaknesses, or take real interest in who they are. This is the endpoint of a system that doesn't treat people as people, and so it creates zombies.
But no, too, is that he just spent a bunch of time talking about how before school was designed to get you ready for a workplace. Well, guess what? In the workplace today, the workplace doesn't treat people as people. So it's not really that surprising, because if the workplace isn't treating like people, the school's just preparing you for real life, which is, hey, when you get a job, the job won't care the type of person you are, or what you care about, or your motivation, or your family, or what you do in your free time. All the job cares about is that you get done what the job says to get done. They don't care about who you are. So in a way, the education system's preparing for this. So I think part of it would have to be jobs would have to change, because I think this is actually a big issue with jobs. I think it is best reflected in the entertainment industry, where we see a lot of video games that suck, and the reason why is because people aren't being treated as people, they're being treated as a machine, and this doesn't work for entertainment, and it shows best in the entertainment industry, but we don't really see the effects as much in other industries. And for an extent, it's fine, but it's not sustainable, is the point I'm trying to make. Is you keep trying to treat people like machines, especially as we're seeing a rise of individualism, which is being extended through the internet. People aren't taking it. People aren't going to put up with it. So it's not sustainable.
The sad thing is that the system of industrial standardization doesn't really have a use anymore, because that's not how the economy works. Very few people work in giant standardized factories where you have to coordinate large amounts of people. And due to the advances due to the digital revolution, coordinating is becoming incredibly easy. And so we've seen the rise of the gig economy, which is more equivalent to what pre-industrial societies were, where you worked seasonally or when you felt like it. And so all of this training and all this sacrifice for the industrial system is no longer useful, and it's not teaching a skill that the population really needs anymore. Furthermore, the kinds of jobs that our school system trains people to be good at are the ones most likely to get wiped out by AI and automating.
Yeah, I think his point is that people are being prepared for the future. So, okay, it's fine, but how long can we keep this going before it's detrimental? Because the point is, with those types of jobs that can be replaced with AI, the point is that those jobs don't push society forward. So if they get replaced, then what do people do?
In traditional education systems, you taught things that were useful for people. You either taught them basic literacy or their occupation.
Thank God he's speaking to this, because there's so much stuff I'll learn in school, and I understand how you do one thing, how you do everything, right? With that being said, there's so much stuff I'll learn, even in English, where I'm learning something and I'm like, so what exactly am I being tested on? Because, for example, this is personal, right? But I'll take a test in a book, and then the teacher explains what happens in the book, and then the test is not asking me what I to think about the messages of the book or anything like that. No, it's asking, so what happened in the book, and why did this character do this or that? So then it makes me wonder, so what's actually the point of it? What is the testing? What is the point of all of this? And that's just English, right? And then I think English matters. You see it the most because this is the language you speak. Nothing you're really being taught actually relates to English once you get to a high school level. And I think the reason why we see a lot of people stuck at a 6th grade level when it comes to speak English and literacy is because when you get to high school, they don't actually advance your English. They keep you stuck there.
If you need to read and write to be a carpenter, those are actually useful skills. You can't not forget those skills.
I think, again, I met Brent just earlier, but I think it's important to hammer home the point, which is that back then, you were taught to read. Do you know why you're taught to read this stuff? Because guess what most Americans were doing? They were buying the newspaper. So you needed to know what's in the news, because then you have to rely on someone else telling you the news if you can't read. Now you don't really need to read that much, because you could just read what someone on Reddit says, and that's good enough. Or you could just turn on Fox News or CNN and listen to what they say. You don't actually really need to be able to be literate.
Modern universities worked is that they weren't about sorting people for social class or providing a standard product. Rather, they were really about learning. There were no tests. People just showed up for as many years as they wanted to learn. If you learned something, that was up to you and your own decision and drive. Again, we may judge.
This is really important, right? Because you can't force someone to learn. Learning in its nature requires intrinsic motivation. And when you try and make learning extrinsic, something external, such as a grade, which is how it is today, you don't actually get people learning. And there are studies that already show that extrinsic motivation discourages behavior. It encourages it temporarily, but it doesn't make it permanent. And for something like learning, no wonder everyone's forgetting what they had. It's because there's such a focus on grades that's extrinsic that people aren't being motivated to do it. The only way people will actually care about what they're learning is if they're intrinsically motivated, and the way you do that is by just having people interested. You know, kids generally are naturally curious, so you play into that, and it's much easier to get kids to care about what they're learning.
This system, but it produced an incredible amount of geniuses.
French is such a dumb language. That's the thing too, that it, like, the way the French language is structured kind of reflects how the French are, which is, oh, we're so fancy. Oh yeah.
In technological progress, whether Aquinas, Isaac Newton, the Enlightenment, Charles Darwin, and more. As an example of the kind of process that's going on here, in America, the drinking age is 21, and teen drinking is frowned upon. What this does...
No, it's frowned upon. No, it's not really frowned upon. By the way, this is kind of controversial. I think the drinking age should be 23. I don't think anyone in college should be allowed to drink. I know colleges say you can't drink. I think if you're at that age, you just shouldn't be able to drink.
Drinking cool, and so when young people go off to college, they start binge drinking. This creates a toxic drinking culture where the authorities don't want them drinking at all, but what ends up happening is the void is filled by a very unhealthy version of drinking. Meanwhile, in Europe, where
I think the big thing, I think even more so, is that here's what I think really is the issue, right? At least in America, is that alcohol isn't treated as something that's dangerous. It's treated as something that's forbidden. It's not treated as something that's dangerous. How many people actually know that alcohol is the only drug where the withdrawal can kill you? As I've said that to people, I've noticed people don't actually know this, but this is like, I didn't know this before. I didn't even know if I was taught this in school. Maybe I was. But alcohol is a very dangerous drug, and it's not treated as it's a dangerous drug in society. It's extremely dangerous. I think part of the reason why people do it so much is because it's socially acceptable to drink alcohol, and it's actually not really discouraged. I would say it's discouraged when you're underage. When you're overaged, it's not really discouraged anymore.
Drinking is approved of, binge drinking is nowhere near as big a problem. People grow up drinking around their parents and adults, so it fits into people's lives as a normal
it's
thing,
the only one where the
not the forbidden fruit. We all know people, especially with children, where if you make something forbidden, it will make it more attractive. What we've done is forced kids to operate against their own biological nature and make them take tests on subjects none of them really care about. This is all against their own consent, and it makes them hate real learning. It makes them resent structure.
I mean, because here's the thing too, right? Is because another reason why I don't think it should be introduced at a young age is because let's go to the extremes. Like fentanyl, that's illegal, right? Let's say we made it legal, even though it's banned. You shouldn't be doing it. Should we let kids try it just so it's more acceptable, but say, oh, this is bad though, don't do it that much? No, we made it illegal. It's bad. So why alcohol also is bad? Why are we going to say, oh, you could try it at a young age, but don't do it that much? No, you shouldn't be really doing it that much at all.
And more, since it was forced down their throats. The thing is that learning in school has nothing to do with real learning. Mm-hmm. Real learning is when you're super passionate at a subject and you go to the library with excitement to check out 5 new books on it. Then you call your friends out something you read and you all grab drinks together to talk about some new theory. This kind of learning is based out of love, is how all brilliance and innovation is formed. Nothing is...
When you said drinking, I just want to note that when Isaac Newton came up with his theories and he was discussing it, he was actually drinking coffee, at least from what I've read.
Accomplished by someone who hates their subject. There's a saying that you can't force a mule to drink, and children are the same.
I should have clarified that. He was in like a coffee shop, and he was discussing his ideas with people while drinking coffee. That's what I meant to say.
Same. The reason our ancestors had a much greater intellectual level and interest as a broader society is that it was seen as fun. Mm-hmm. Talking at the ancient Greeks, the Napoleonic War, philosophy was what you and the boys did for fun. Mm-hmm. In a society that doesn't force people to learn, those who just want to hunt, flirt with girls, or work can do so, and those who want to talk about intellectual stuff also do so.
Yeah, because I think we see this a lot where everything... I think we even see it, again, ties to the extrinsic and intrinsic, which is everything you acquire has to be extremely relevant to you. For example, in school, your kids, why is this important, right? Whatever happened to doing something for the sake of doing something? I'll see you later. I think a lot of things we do today, we don't really do things for the sake of doing it. We do it because we have to, or it's somehow beneficial. For example, I think there are even a lot of people reading, right? It's treated as something you should do because it's beneficial, because you have to do it. Whatever happened to reading because of the sake of reading?
By forcing the whole society through this process, it created a profound resentment against intellectuals and those who liked the topics discussed in school. In previous eras, having studied the classics and culture was seen as positive and the marker of a gentleman. We don't have a word for that today, and the only term for someone who studies those sorts of things is the derogatory nerd. People hated the nerds and the teachers' pets, since they liked the thing the rest of us hated. Mm-hmm. I think the mass education system, which we all had to go through, is what created our society's obsession, partly with hedonism, dislike of intellectual life and structure.
I don't think it's exactly that. I think more so it has to do with the grading system. Because even back then, you had kids that had to go through school. Okay, sure. I think it's because grades were seen as something that's so important. I think grades are solely responsible for this. Or not solely, I think they're largely responsible for this. Because grades give out an objective measurement on your intelligence. And by doing so, it creates a situation where if you have too high of a grade, oh, you're a nerd. Or if it's basically a measurement of how smart you are, and by doing so, it's a terrible metric, because especially because most of the people learn in school they don't even retain. I think this is really the cause of grades.
How happy everyone was when we had a day without school, or when the teacher was sick so the substitute came in. The reason the school system builds up such collective resentment is that it's a bureaucratic structure that doesn't treat you as a person. Every other era of history was intensely personal. You knew everyone in your village and worked for your parents or your neighbor. There were very serious flaws to this system, but everything was tailored to you as a person. You were taught in the way that was best for you as an individual, and if you did well, your family did better, not some impersonal bureaucracy. What I've found is that if you treat people with dignity, give them hope, listen to their problems, and treat them like actual people, is that they will die for you. This is what great leaders do. They make the people feel seen and then demonstrate their inner desires in action. We're living...
I think this is actually the exact reason why many people work for a corporate company today, don't care for the company they're working for, because the company openly shows they don't care about them, because they don't. If the companies actually cared about their people, which people say can't happen, I think we could live in a world where as companies are run by people, if the people in them actually cared about the people working in them, I think companies could be much more effective.
Creatures, and we follow those who treat us well and view those who don't with contempt. The educational system doesn't care about you. Thus, it elicits no loyalty and any desire to
all it cares about is that, did you get a good enough number on the test? Oh, then you're smart.
Excel inside of it. The problem here is that the story of history is the story of those who choose to excel.
All right, here we go. This is the biggest problem of all of it. Not the teachers themselves, more so there's a shortage of teachers, and well, really the issue is that we have two things are true. One, public education is free and required for everyone. So that's true. It's free, required, government pays for it, which you're paying for through taxes, right? And then teachers, in order to be a teacher, are expected to pay to go to college, and which the government does not pay for, to then teach. So, in a way, it kind of doesn't make much sense. I'm not saying what should happen, I'm just pointing out that it doesn't make sense that we're providing a free education, but the people that are providing the education aren't also getting their education for free. Isn't that kind of an issue?
In general, I think teachers are good people. They work a job with no hope of social mobility and low pay, in most cases since they genuinely want to help people, or they like kids. I've met many teachers, and they often really do care about their students,
the issue is that, especially administration, the government, everything, even parents, generally, they don't care about teachers. I think that's the other issue.
Hamstrung by an impersonal bureaucratic system. They also want to improve the world. However, there's balance in all things, and all of these positive traits do come with negatives. The incentives provided by the system we live in has created a poisonous social class and incentive for teachers that has changed the profession into something unimaginable from what was originally planned. I grew up in the Rust Belt, and so I saw a lot of decaying buildings as a child, and it's honestly nice in its own kind of twisted way to see how rapidly nature fills the void. It's really interesting to see how buildings decay, and what part
right? Because when they're maintained, it looks nice, but nature always wins in the end. It actually is kind of
the house
nice
or the building nature reclaims first. The force of entropy is universal, and this process of decay occurs in every single social structure in the same manner as it does as our physical buildings. Some systems are better than others, and thus are better able to fight against the process of natural entropy. The republic that came out of the French Revolution lasted months, while that which came out of the American Revolution lasted 250 years.
As of this video,
we really shit on feudalism and other pre-industrial systems in our society, but the reason they lasted for hundreds or thousands of years is that they established good incentives for stability. Every social class in medieval Europe was expected to push their own self-interest, but in doing so, they clashed with other social classes which were also pushing their interests, which created a balance across the entire social ecosystem. These kinds of checks and balances is why America has become the most successful country in history. In the pre-industrial world, the top incentive for educating people well was that it was parents and communities were responsible for their own children. You educated your kids correctly, since if you didn't, they couldn't become competent adults who could support you in old age, continue your family line, or keep your business running. Since the
again, I think the other thing too is that you can't read the paper. I know I'm saying it's because it's so important, because socially it was something that every American would do. The paper was such a big part of American life. So if you can't read the paper, you're kind of an outcast.
The idea that humans are inherently good and perfectible has gained currency. This means that we've removed the concept that you need to have structures or checks and balances against the negatives of human nature. Thus, we constructed no incentives for teachers to not turn their power against the entire society so they could get more authority. It's very apparent that teachers as a social class have betrayed their duty to the rest of the society. Modern American
I think it goes both ways, because you have that, but you also have students that give a teacher a really hard time. And the schools, a lot of school systems, where they're designed, even though they have detention, schools handle it differently. And a lot of times the school doesn't support the teachers. So a lot of students also will go against the teacher, and they won't allow the teacher to be efficient. So I think it really does go both ways.
They're incredibly left-wing and push a worldview that is in direct opposition to the tax-paying public's norms, where our society hired teachers as a replacement for community and family education, and then the teachers, rather than teaching useful skills or the values of the broader society, just taught the students what was useful for them as an occupation, what they wanted.
This is why I think if parents have the ability to do so, and they actually are willing to actually put in effort towards their kid, I think homeschooling, I think, is a great option. I know there's a lot of, it's seen as a negative thing. I think it can be very positive, because I think if you teach your kid, you avoid all these issues.
And in fact, they teach their students to hate the society and destroy the society that supports them and pays for the schools.
Is that exactly
You
true?
legitimately hear horror stories, which you can look up yourself, but many of these seem too crazy to be real. For elementary school students, you'll have drag queen story hours,
I think it's highly dependent on what school you go to.
Library books,
it's anecdotal.
Teaching homosexuality,
Oh, wait, let me look at
drag
that
queen
statistic.
story hours.
87% of books removed from Florida schools. Why were those even in schools?
There's porn and library books, teaching homosexuality to 6-year-old kids who don't even know what sexual attraction is.
I mean, there's a reason why when it's taught progressively. You don't just learn how kids are made instantly. You learn how the body works first, and then over time you learn a bit more about the body, and you start to learn a little bit. You don't just learn it all in one shot.
Telling kids that changing their gender will solve all their mental health issues, and anyone who questions this is evil. Teaching,
I think that's kind of a straw man too. I don't think that's fully their argument, though.
That America and their societies are evil, which there's nothing they can do about, and they're forever stuck in cultural sin for their race. They've literally started segregating students by race to varying degrees in different schools across the country. From personal experience, in my high school,
I know they do it for like college. This is for high school stuff.
Gradually changed the entire curriculum to be around left-wing social issues. The Latin curriculum changed to about race, sex, and oppression in the Roman Empire. I mean, the thing is, there were all of 4 black people in the Roman Empire, so that's ridiculous.
Like, obviously that's bad, but to say this is the education as a whole isn't true. I think this is a point to make that the education system has corruption. I think is a fair point.
We stopped teaching Shakespeare, Beowulf, and Dickens at all, replacing them with racial...
See, my school, then again, I go to private school, so it's different. My school did teach Shakespeare, although not as much. I did watch Shakespeare plays. It's interesting to watch, especially because he invented a lot of modern tropes.
Authors from the last 10 years. Literally every single subject is built around race, sex, or a leftist social...
Again, I think this is anecdotal. I think it highly depends on what school you go to. If he had a statistic on this for the whole country, I'd be a bit more have an
They
opinion.
removed talking about the Industrial or French revolutions from our history curriculum to talk about the Atlantic slave trade for more time. We would have assemblies literally every week where the only topics discussed were things related to leftist social issues. I literally had a bet 2 years in a row. For the first year, I said for every assembly about race, I got a quarter, and for literally any other topic, my friend got a quarter. I
Okay.
made money that year. The next year, I changed my bet to be about gender identity, and I made money that year too. The year after I left high school, the school started having social justice
This is
week.
the thing I think is that parents, if a parent disagrees with this is how a kid is taught, and they have the time to homeschool a kid, homeschool your kid. I think if you don't agree with the school, and you want them to teach what you think they should be learning, then you should teach them yourself. I think it's completely reasonable to do.
It was a mandatory week which was spent entirely based around topics of social justice. They would literally have assemblies to work people into frenzies.
There's also, I think, again, this is anecdotal. It's also ignoring the other opposite extreme. He's showing one extreme, and I think in a way it's showing a bit of a bias. So I wanted to say that the other extreme of this is you go to a school in, I don't know, a rural part of America, and you're not taught about evolution. You're taught that it's only through God, right? I'm sure you may have heard of this before of students not being taught evolution because it's false or stuff like that. I think it's the other end of the spectrum, and it does help the overarching point that there are a lot of teachers that aren't very high quality, and part of this is influenced by the school system, and in nature, because they choose who gets hired, they kind of influence this.
Off left-wing social issues, which is exactly like Hate Week from 1984. The school spent thousands of dollars to fly in a speaker from New Mexico to say that violence was acceptable to achieve social justice. This is really bad. Schools have given up any opportunity to actually teach and instead have become places of ideological indoctrination. This level of stuff is only what you would see in totalitarian countries. This has plummeted educational standards for obvious reasons. Many schools in blue states have just stopped having tests in general since people of color score worse on them. This is complete madness.
That's obviously...
Why did teachers betray their societies? I think it's since there's no...
again, I do think grades are bad, so if you're removing it, it's good. But I think they're doing it for the wrong reasons.
No reason not to, and they directly benefit from it.
Because if you remove grades but change nothing else, it doesn't actually fix anything.
Our society, since we view people as machines and undervalue the importance of upbringing and culture, gave teachers the equivalent of a social atom bomb without any oversight, without even realizing it. We let them raise our children. The average child spends much more waking time in school than with their parents. I've talked in many videos about how important the values you raise your children with are for their and the society's future development. How you can look to family structure to predict what the political ideology or governance system of a society is. How the emotions you raise a society with determines its culture and philosophy. With no oversight, we let teachers raise our children, and of course they raised them to be what the teachers wanted them to be.
Well, this is something that would happen no matter this is something that happens no matter who you let teach your kids. So again, nothing stops you to homeschool your kids if you want to, other than the time you have. And if you have the time to do so, there's that. If you could afford private education, you could go to a different school. You can move to a different location that has an education system you agree with. So there is mobility. So if this is an issue, I think this is a very personal issue. I don't think this is the overarching problem.
As women's entrance into the workforce, suburbanization, and longer working hours weakens the power and unity of the family, schools filled the void. Schools are meant to fill a void left by working moms. On top of this, there was no incentive for quality control. Teachers bear none of the costs for the students they send into society. They're just stuck with a new wave of kids to pass on in the next year without too much stress or trouble. For an example of a completely different, yet modern dynamic, in the Soviet Union, they would keep teachers the same students for 5 years, and teachers were expected to take personal interest in the kids.
Is that a good example to use, though? I mean, let's be real, right? Are we really going to talk about what the Soviet Union did for education? I mean, I feel like there are better examples out there. Maybe they could be right, sure. I'm not saying it didn't work. I think there is value in this. But I think there are better examples you could have chosen than the Soviet Union.
Including meeting their parents and visiting them at home. In modern America, that would be a giant violation of individualism and privacy. It's an example of what a completely different society's model of education is.
Well, I think it's more than that. Teachers wouldn't do that too, because teachers are very busy doing so much stuff outside of school anyway. And they still communicate with parents through parent emails. There are parent-teacher conferences. So this is something that still happens.
The kind of people teachers tend to be. They are overwhelmingly women, with 3/4 of teachers being female. They tend to be higher in trait agreeability, or how much pleasure you derive from giving to other people, being in emotional harmony, and how much you find conflict stressful. Women are on average higher in agreeability than men. Highly agreeable people tend to be teachers since they're attracted to jobs in which they can help people, and being a teacher is uncompetitive. Fine. Agreeable people are bad at managing things or making hard decisions. They tend to be cowardly.
This is on an individual basis, right? So even if we're saying women are more agreeable, okay, sure. That's still something that could be overcome. That's still something that could be worked on. And I don't really think this is the overarching problem.
The shadow of agreeability is resentfulness and manipulation. I score very low in agreeability. If I don't like someone, I'll just tell them to fuck off. When I expect something, I tell people about it. Agreeable people can't do this. Given teachers are in positions of authority, that means they rule through manipulation. This means that when
I don't know if that's exactly true though. So I'm trying to think about it. I mean, I think there are advantages and disadvantages to teaching if you're agreeable, sure. I don't know if that makes you a bad teacher. Maybe it depends on the subject matter. But I mean, especially you just said earlier, I think if teaching's, especially because teaching's supposed to be intrinsic, and you can't really measure education, why is it bad to be agreeable? Because wouldn't that mean that if you're agreeable, you're more likely to care about a student's interests? So I don't really know if that's a strong argument.
Schools or bureaucracy want you to do something. They try to manipulate you through guilt to show why it's actually in your self-interest or you're a bad person for not doing it. I actually think this is the origins of woke culture psychologically, given we were all raised by teachers. Thus, it became the ruling ideology of our society. Teachers tend to be smart and articulate people, but due to their uncompetitive nature, they tend to not be good at dealing with the real world, which is a place of brutal Darwinistic competition.
Oh yeah, that's another thing. I think that is a valid point, right? That a lot of the people that are teachers are teaching, but they have no experience in the real world. And that's one of the things I've wondered, actually. I don't remember how long, but I've always wondered throughout school. I always wanted to know. So what did my teacher do other than a teacher? And the teachers I respect the most. I respect all my teachers, but the teachers I value the most, I should say, or find the most impressive, are the teachers that actually did something and then decided to teach, because they actually are speaking from experience. So I think they have a better opportunity to know what's relevant and what's not relevant. It's not perfect. They still have to teach to a test, sure. But at least they know what stuff would actually be important if you wanted to get a job in a specific field.
Us teachers by nature tend to be envious and resentful.
And it depends on the subject, right? If you're teaching English and you're just teaching how to be better at English, it doesn't really matter how much of the real world you've been in. What matters is how well you can, how literate you are.
They believe since they are intelligent and caring, they deserve money and power, unlike those stupid and immoral businessmen, generals, or politicians.
Is that exactly
Teachers
true?
Are never expected to confront the real world due to the structure.
That ignores the fact that teachers get paid very low, yet choose to be teachers anyway.
Of their job, and so don't get humbled. What we've gotten here...
And it ignores the fact, too, that a lot of teachers get a job outside of teaching that they have to get for the summer, so they can stay afloat.
Is a giant social class of resentful, intelligent, articulate people who are good at manipulating groups of people to follow their agenda, since that's their daily job. We then gave them control of raising our children.
Know about that.
Does anyone see the problem that's set up here? This then resulted in gradually turning our society into a classroom. Firstly, it resulted in spreading insane and foolish beliefs about the world that...
Yeah, I have to question this. I think this is very anecdotal. I don't think this is true for a whole. And again, I mentioned the other extreme, people being taught that evolution's fake. So I think this is an issue as a whole, sure. I think there's an issue of bias as a whole because people are biased. and I don't really know how you could filter that other than have people that are better at making hiring decisions.
Only people who don't deal with the actual world could believe, like, that we control reality, or that whiteness doesn't actually mean whiteness. At the same time, dude.
Again, I have to question how true that actually is for the education system.
Due to having an agreeable educator population, it's turned schools and thus our entire society into an agreeable place. Teachers subconsciously know their inadequacy against the real world, and thus try to blot it out in the classroom. I remember when I was 10, I drew pictures of swords, and the teacher called my parents in since they were worried I might become violent. When I was 13, my friends and I were playing a board game, and we were arguing about the rules. We were doing it politely and very civilly, but the teachers didn't like that we were arguing at all.
That sounds
and
like a
said if we didn't
issue
stop, they'd keep us from playing the game.
I think, again, it shows that there can be issues with bad teachers, and there isn't really a system in place to filter good and bad teachers. I think that would happen no matter what. The only way you could avoid it is if you had tutors, because the way like tutors work is if they do a good job, people recommend them. So then they teach more and more kids, especially because back then when people were less literate, only the higher ups, only people who were part of the noble class would really be able to learn to read and write. They would have tutors that have had a past of being able to learn, and they actually did a good job, so you get recommended.
This creates a very fake, plastic, and sterile environment. When people go to school, they're putting up a facade that isn't really them. If you stood up and actually said your beliefs about things in class, like, we're not going to have jobs at the end of this.
You can do that.
That the elites in the system don't care about us at all. I don't think India is that advanced a society.
You can say that. I mean, this is maybe in your school, sure. I mean, you could say what you think. This isn't an issue. It's only an issue when you say it in a way that's not... How do I say this? If you say it in a way that comes across as attacking, as if you come across emotionally is what I'm trying to say. If you want to say what you believe, then you could say that. I think the issue actually more so, if we're going to talk about this, is kids are vulnerable. So if you only present them one side of a story, then they can't really know the other side. And that's why I have a huge respect for teachers, especially history teachers, who teach their students to critically think. So instead of teaching students what to think, they teach students how to think. I think that's a very valuable, I think that's a very good way to teach students, I think it's a very good way to just teach students in general.
Or the food in the cafeteria sucks, you'll be told to go to the principal because what you said is deeply inappropriate. However, think of it this way. For the vast majority of waking hours for our children, they cannot be honest and authentic about who they are, and they must play a social role. And this doesn't really benefit anyone, but it does very much play into women's strengths. And with teachers, they know how weak they are and how tenuously they can actually hold on to power.
I don't know if he realizes this, but just by saying this, he is a bit biased. And I don't know if he recognizes it or not. It comes across as he's biased a bit towards women. Because yeah, okay, sure, he has the stat that women can tend to be more agreeable. Okay. But then he's going across to say that means they're bad teachers. I don't know if that's exactly true. I wouldn't even say that's a problem. Just because something's different doesn't mean it's bad. It comes across as he's trying to say that they're bad because they're different.
World. And so they make this arbitrary, fake, and soft system since they're scared of actually leading. I think the reason our society hates masculinity is that men are harder to manage in the machine that
That's a completely different issue that a lot of it has to do with social media.
Is industrial civilization. Men will fight back if you push them too hard. Women won't. The modern educational system...
Again, that's not true. Generally, maybe that's true. I don't know if that's true all the time. I mean... the more people you interact with, I mean, especially like if you push anyone too hard, they can push. I know women who, if you push them something, they'll get annoyed with you and they'll fight back. I mean, I think this is a lack of perspective.
Its values compliance, quietness, stillness, sitting down, following orders, and that sort of thing is a system made for women by women. Evidence of this is that we've put millions of boys on Adderall or a form of meth just to get them to sit around for 8 hours a day.
Now, that obviously is an issue. I don't think it has to do with women. I think that's just an issue of the way school's designed. You're being treated as wrong because you can't pay attention because something's boring. Obviously, that's pretty stupid. Because what? You don't want to pay attention to someone who's boring? Instead of maybe giving someone pills, maybe we should hire someone who's better at communicating. Right? I think that's kind of obvious.
This is why girls get much better grades than boys, and this year, universities will be 2/3 female. As an example of male-style teaching, let me tell you a story. I was in high school as a senior, and I was running a project with a bunch of freshman boys. I was responsible for the project to a teacher I was friends with. I didn't really care what the freshmen thought, and so I took the gloves off because they were all lazy and weren't getting stuff done. I started giving them orders, splitting them to different groups, swearing and insulting them when I didn't do what I liked, hitting their tables with a ruler and that sort of thing.
Here's the thing. This is what I've learned. It also applies to the real world too, especially with jobs. Is that if you're in a group and you have someone who's not doing work, if you want to show, oh, they're doing work, okay, fine. What you actually do is you just pretend they don't exist. If they're not going to do work, don't waste your time, because if you keep getting on them, they're not going to do anything. So you're just wasting your time, and you're better off spending that time getting the job done. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters, is getting the job done. And if he won't help, then so be it. Let's everyone else who's here that wants to get it done, get it done. And if he's not happy with the grade he gets because it wasn't done as well, then so be it.
Surprised me is they loved it. They started the project in complete apathy, and once I did that, they finished it happily. They loved me, and I got a great...
That being said, there is value in having good leadership skills. I think you could be both, right? You could distribute work, but at the same time, someone doesn't get it done, get on them. But if they don't do it, just do it. If it has to get done, then give it to someone else who will actually care.
Relationship among the freshmen. Whenever I'd walk through their hallway, they'd hit me up and high-five me. The thing is that no teacher can behave in that way since our society is so feminized. We know men can be educated since it's what most of the history of education has been like. It has to be competitive, energetic, rough, fact-based, and driven off personal initiative. That would scare female teachers, though, since they don't like aggression or roughness.
Again,
our school system domesticates the population, makes them weak,
and it makes sense
since that's what makes it easier for female teachers to manage. My mother would joke growing up that the reason school started so early was that the kids would be tired and thus easier to manage. One of the themes here is that
another thing. Yeah, why is school so early? Oh, I know why. It's because parents have jobs, so you need to start school before the job starts. So that way you can put your kids away before you go to your job. That's why school starts so early.
Education system could be vastly different from what it currently is. Imagine if they played capture the flag and paintball in school. That would be more useful for kids' lives than teaching them algebra.
To be fair, you could play sports in school. So I think that's not really a strong argument, because if you want to do something similar, you can do sports in school.
Give them practical skills like teamwork, charisma, practicality, the value of pain, and more.
School.
They would use that more than algebra in their daily lives. Why does our society have high school? Nothing learned there is actually useful.
That's something I can completely agree with, 100%. And I think I think it shows best when he said that most people have their have a reading level of at a sixth grade reading level. I think a big part of that reflects on high schools and the fact that a lot of high schools don't actually teach. They just make you memorize stuff, and that doesn't actually benefit you.
Remember or really use anything I learned in high school. Kids would be better served rather than going to high school, going to trade school for an occupation, or going to a more loose university.
How about this? Instead of going to school, they get a job. Oh my god, kids working? What? Oh my god. No, what? You can't have kids work. What if they have an internship or something? What if we actually encourage kids to get a job so they can actually get experience? Something.
Style place where they could study for their career or academic interest what matters most to their future lives. This sounds crazy, but this is the system that Germany uses. A lot of Nordic countries that score much higher than
us. Sweden does this. I heard they had success too.
In education, have half the actual amount of class time in elementary school. They start school years later, or they don't give homework. We found from studies that people can only really learn for 3 hours a day. I want the main theme of this video to be that we could restructure education.
I don't know how true this is. I think because does that include giving someone a break? Because I think if you were to spend 3 hours learning, have a 3 hour break, and then start learning again, I think you could learn more stuff.
Learn for 3 hours a day. I want the main theme of this video to be that we could restructure education far beyond what any of us imagine and get better results. Furthermore, that if we make school fun and relatable,
I think the biggest issue, again, which you didn't really touch on, is grades. I think the fact that we have a grading system at all, I think really hinders it, because it's trying to create an objective measurement. I think if you actually focus more on just actually getting kids to care about something intrinsically, this would solve a lot of the issues today.
we can also still get better results. This point reminds me of a story in my gap year when I went to a language school in France.
Okay.
We only had 3 hours of class a day, and they taught French through interactive conversations where you had to use French practically without reference to your home language. I learned more French, which I still remember until now, in those 3 months than the nearly a decade of Latin or French that I took in grade school.
Language is something you have to practice, so you have to experience it. You can only learn so much language by reading it through a book, because if you only learn a language through a book, guess what? You're going to get really good at reading that language in a book, but you're not going to get really good at actually speaking it or listening to it. Because if you spend most of your time in school learning a language by reading, no wonder you're not going to be able to really understand a language through words. Wouldn't it make sense in school to watch a movie in Spanish? Why have I never had that happen ever? Right? Everything I learned in Spanish, when I learned Spanish, is through a textbook. Yet, it's somewhere to... I've never once saw a Spanish movie or media. I've only spent... Obviously, we have verbal tests, sure. But it's so small and small majority of the time, where most of the language that's done is done through communication of speaking. Making school fun can be done by your teacher. I have had teachers that actually do make school fun. I think the way school's designed, though, especially right now, it's very difficult to do so. And also because teachers aren't paid that much. And also teachers don't have much room to actually make school fun where they do what they want to do.
Cool, learning through rote. The free time that gave me let me go to local bars and meet French people, which also improved my French more than going to a class. We don't have to suffer to be successful. Let the people who want to learn, and let those who just want to get a job. However, this isn't what's occurring. We're seeing rapidly decreasing educational standards. The next generation is retarded, as most of my generation is. With indoctrination taking over schools, it seems that socialization and turning people into cogs is more...
I mean, again, so with socialization, that's not really an issue with school, I would say. That's more so has to do with technology. I think the fact that technology is being incorporated to school at a young age, I think is an issue. I don't know why we're letting kids use a computer at 6 years old. Because you can have the time to learn a computer. It's not difficult to learn how to use a computer. My dad was able to learn to use a computer. This isn't some magical thing that's difficult to do. Why are we letting kids use a computer at a young age?
Important for our elite in schools than teaching people. Furthermore, I think the powerful in our society would agree with that. They don't want smart people, they ask too many questions. As I've said in
you just want people... that's the thing too, is you don't want people that just know things. You want people that are insightful. I think there's much more value in having people that can be insightful and actually think about things than being able to just know things.
Previous videos, I'm worried that the Unabomber and Mouse Utopia were right. I don't have the time to explain it here, so here's a text wall. That means in short term that people will become more like zombies and stupider until society breaks down. We will see a behavioral sink. I think the Industrial Revolution has burned social institutions so much so that we can't go back. I don't think we're going to recreate the social structure where strangers educate our children.
I'm going to be honest. I think the best solution we have right now is if... I think first off, if people get married where there's a dynamic where one person's working and the other person isn't, the parent that isn't working homeschools their kid, I think that's the way you solve this problem. I think there you go. The way you solve this problem, especially if you're a parent, I think if you homeschool your kid, I wasn't homeschooled, right? But I think there is value in being homeschooled.
With the global population collapse, what we're seeing is that only the rural and religious will have children and inherit the earth. I'm guessing community and
Okay.
religious-based education will fill the void by the 22nd century. Something my friends and I have been talking about is that
Oh
if
yeah,
we
I
get
don't know.
wealthier and
Let me
better...
see. Let me see what this is. Historical fertility rates. Okay. This is just based on country though. And then again, you're this is ignoring too. This isn't really that valuable statistic because America as a whole relies on immigrants, and a lot of the people don't know this, but a lot of people that are coming here today, that are having these high level jobs, are people that are immigrating to America.
Second century. Something my friends and I have been talking about is that if we get wealthier and better connected, is forming a community of smart people and educating each other's children. We've seen homeschooling increase massively in
glad you brought this
popularity
up.
since COVID. Basically, community homeschooling reaches the point of forming new schools. Ironically, this would be a return of what the original American school system was about. Something
I
I
think the
would
reason why homeschooling's beneficial too is because I haven't done it. I don't know if there are grades in homeschool. What I do know is that I think, at least in theory, of thinking about it on paper, I don't know how it is actually, but at least thinking about it, I think it would give kids more ability to be intrinsically motivated about learning.
love to see is competition in schools. Each parent has a voucher to send their kids to any school in the surrounding area. Anyone can open a school. Good schools get more kids that go to them and thus more taxpayer money.
But I think, first of all, a lot of people open schools are private, so those have to be paid for, and they're public. It's tough to get the support from people.
Good schools form branches and become franchises. Bad schools die out. Rather than public schools, we'd have competing independent schools. This would be extending free market principles to schools and...
Well, there was virtual learning, though. You didn't have to do it, at least not here. Because you still could have went through public education and just let the school teach you. It just wasn't very effective.
Thus create accountability. As of now, entrenched interests will not let this happen. However, the world is out to change a lot very quickly. For smart, enterprising people, a lot of amazing changes can be made in the education system. I know there are people in my audience who want to fix education, and I wish them all the best in the world. I hope this video has been helpful.
I think the best thing each individual could do is if they don't like the school they have, if you live in an area that has a bad education, homeschool your kid. Now, I live in New Jersey. It has the best K through 12 education in the country, right? So here, wouldn't really make much sense to homeschool your kid. But if you live somewhere more Central America or West, then I think it would make much more sense, especially if you don't agree with the school system's teaching, depending on what you personally believe. And then too, I've seen people online attack, oh, why do parents not like what the school teaches their kids? I mean, it's fine. This was definitely an interesting video, though. What do some people have to say about this? Yeah, look into that. The downfall of the public school system was apparent even in the 1970s. Mother graduated with what she considered one of the better Seattle schools for time, 1970s, and found herself completely unequipped for the adult world. Wow. How unsurprising. Her mother never taught her anything. That's a big problem right there. Like budgeting, civics, cooking. Wow, you know, why... this is stuff that should be taught, but it's not. Whatever. Carbonated tool. Gen Xers like my mom needed that on schools. I think that it's definitely a complicated issue. I think the video definitely had biases. Everyone's biased, right? I think it had certain biases that wasn't really beneficial to getting the conversation forward. But it was still a good video. I liked it.